Less than a month into 2026, and already the world looks different.
To what extent will allies and partners of the United States still consider the United States an ally or a partner if this persists?
U.S. forces removed a sitting president from Venezuela. Protests erupted in Iran amid signals of support from Washington. And Greenland's territorial status has become a subject of open debate. At Davos, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney put it bluntly: the old order is not coming back. Nostalgia is not a strategy. So what comes next?
I hope that all of us are learning that institutions are only as strong as the practices that undergird them. To that extent, we can port that kind of same insight into international relations. The practices, how people are actually doing international relations, that's what's going to make the system run.
For decades, the United States underwrote a rules-based international system. Trade agreements, security alliances, institutions designed to keep the peace. Now, that system is under strain. Some say the cracks were decades in the making. Some say otherwise.
Like any Jenga tower, you can take off the pillars and the structure will remain standing right up until the moment that it doesn't. And so what we're seeing is now we're in this sort of cascade moment where it does seem to be falling apart.
Either way, the questions are urgent. What replaces the old order? Is this a transition or something more like a rupture? And in a world where power is shifting, what does cooperation look like going forward?
Let's not bemoan what's gone. Let's just live with it and make the best of it and look for new possibilities.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, the global order in crisis. What comes next? Joining us today is Professor Amitav Acharya, Professor Daniel Dresner, and Professor Stacy Goddard. Professor Acharya is the UNESCO Chair in Transnational Challenges and Governance at American University and author of The Once and Future World Order. Professor Dresner is Academic Dean and Distinguished Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and Professor Goddard is Associate Provost at Wellesley College and author of When Might Makes Right, Rising Powers in the World Order. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020.
So welcome to the three of you. It really is a pleasure to have you here today with all that is going on. I hope we can make some sense of it. So Dan, I wanted to start with you. I think it's very easy for a lot of us to take for granted the fact that we grew up in this somewhat predictable international system, or maybe it just seems predictable in hindsight. And I think a lot of us are looking at this uncertain world and we're trying to put a framework around this changing system. But I think it's important to start with a little bit of international relations theory, particularly for those who weren't steeped in it. What are we talking about when we talk about world order? And where do you rank this international liberal order that we've had since, the post-World War II world order on the scale from kind of zombie to, we're just tinkering around and doing some renovations here?
Well, first of all, as an international relations professor, we should always start every conversation with some introduction to international relations theory. I'm glad we've all acknowledged that. That's a good way to start. When we talk about order, we are talking about the global rules of the game, not just the ones that are written and codified, but also the sort of unspoken ones, the sort of informal ones as well. And there have been times in global history where, in fact, it has been what we would consider a Hobbesian order, where really anything goes. It's a war of all against all. Life can be nasty, brutish, and short. The liberal international order that you're referring to is somewhat different, beginning in the end of World War II in the Western Bloc, and then after the end of the Cold War more globally. You really did see the codifying of a whole set of rules regarding, the territorial boundaries, regarding global security, regarding international economics, trade, finance, and so forth. Now, to be clear, the liberal international order was never entirely liberal. It was never entirely international. And the United States on occasion acted in a hypocritical fashion. So did every other great power, I would point out. The difference was that you could argue in the main, the United States, as the most powerful actor in the system, also binded itself to the rules of the system. The rules that it created in part served its own interests, but there were times where occasionally it didn't want to comply with those rules, and every once in a while it would violate them. But most of the time it recognized there was a long-term value in adhering to the rules of the game because it incentivized others to do so as well. Now, when you talk about what is the current state of the liberal international order, I have to admit, I'm going to be extremely pessimistic here. Think of a real estate, since we have a president who's a real estate guy, the real estate term would be to say that at best, the property we are looking at, if you're talking about the liberal international order, has good bones, right? Like the general principles have some value to them, but there is so much that would need to go into, rehabbing. You need to do a gut rehab. The problem is that we've seen so many contradictions build up over the last 10 to 15 years. And that has been accelerated in the last year with Donald Trump. So Elizabeth Saunders and I wrote a piece that came out in Foreign Affairs on the website yesterday that basically points out Donald Trump is not the author of the sort of downfall of the liberal international order, but he has undeniably accelerated its demise. He's basically poured kerosene over everything and then lit a match. So could you see a somehow sort of revival of the liberal international order in a post-Trump world? It's possible, but the adage goes, twice shame on me. This is the second go around with Trump, and this is the second go around with the United States electing someone who seems quite willing to disrupt the liberal international order. Regardless of what happens over the next 3 years, it will be very interesting to see how the rest of the world reacts, even if you have a new president who says the right things when it comes to the liberal international order.
Right. Thank you for that. Amma, turning to you, you've written a lot that the world order is basically this iterative global process shaped by ideas and norms over a much longer period of time that goes beyond, let's say the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. So from that longer term perspective, how do you interpret this current recalibration of the world order, and what are some of the scenarios that you're envisioning?
Thanks very much. Before I answer the question you just posed, Dan just said about the liberal order. I also agree that the liberal order is not coming back, and its death was predicted not by Mark Carney or highlighted, but has been, people have been saying that for 12 years, 15 years. It won't be a hegemonic order, the only game in town. It will have to coexist with spheres of influence, Chinese organized world order, and the like. So you'll have what I call a multiplex concept. Answering your question directly, why not going to disappear completely? Elements like interdependence, economic interdependence or trade, openness of seas, humanitarian values, independence of states, sovereignty. These are not necessarily Westphalian creation. These are not necessarily American creation or European creation. So that's what my book argues. I did this book, 5,000 Years of History, basically to trace backwards the origins of many of these concepts we call world order, not just historically, but today. And I found that many of them emerged in multiple parts of the world in rudimentary foundational forms, admittedly imperfect.
Fantastic. Thank you. So maybe there's a little bit of optimism that there's sort of this, human instinct to create alliances and have, some sort of order that goes beyond, just the Hobbesian alternative. So Stacey, turning to you, together with Abraham Newman, you've developed this concept of neo-royalism. Could you briefly explain why you think, what that is and why you see that as a useful lens for understanding today's international order? And also maybe a little bit about how that differs from what I think a lot of people are talking about, which is spheres of influence.
Yeah, thank you for organizing this, Courtney, and Network 2020. So I think it helps, and I'll pick up a bit where Dan left off on the liberal international order. To understand neo-royalism, it helps to explain what it's not. Where Abe and I started out with neo-royalism is we just saw a lot of stuff that sat rather uneasily with this world, right? So if you are in an age of enhancing national, why attack Venezuela? Like, what's the point? For oil that nobody actually wants to refine? If you're trying to build a sphere of influence, why threaten Greenland? Right? You already have a sphere of influence in Greenland. You have one very robust military base since you've had since the Cold War, and the right to build an infinite amount more, right? There's no need to expand into Greenland. You've already expanded into Greenland and you have helpful allies there. So what Abe and I think we're actually seeing is not great power competition. It's something that we refer to neo-royalism. Right. So this, too, by the way, has a long lineage. We oftentimes tend to think of 17th century Europe, but you can also think of the Mughal Empire. You can think of the Mongol Empire, right? Any sort of real kind of sovereign imperial formation. And the idea is that the actors in this order, they're not nation states. They're ultimately royal cliques. These are groups that are centered around somebody who sees themselves as an absolute sovereign. They can include members of the family. They can include, kind of providers of capital and support for that organization. They can include ideologues that lend legitimacy to the clique. Right. But this is really fundamentally the unit that we say Trump at least would like to see dominate. Right. And the purpose here and the process is all very different. Right. So the purpose here is not to enhance national security or enhance national wealth. It's to enhance security and symbolic status. Right. So even to be clear, at the expense of national security. Right. And so, and obviously then too, the foreign policy processes aren't being done by a state. They're not being done by a bureaucracy. They're being done by this really, really small. And this is what we are to make sense of this.
Great. Thank you. So Dan, you've done a lot on economic statecraft, international political economy, using Stacey's framework, jumping off from that. How do you see the role that the economy is playing in shaping the world order? Do you agree with this assessment of neo-royalism, and what are some of the risks or opportunities of this alignment?
Sure, thanks. But to focus your answer on Stacey's, their co-author piece on neo-royalism, I think I would say a couple things on this. The first is that one of the reasons this has been able to come about is, and this is a shift not just within the United States, but within a couple of other countries, but it's the U.S. shift that's most pronounced, is that, and this predates Trump, is that we've seen a sort of shifting of foreign policy responsibilities from Congress and other institutions to the executive branch, and then within the executive branch, consolidated within the presidency. These have been slow motion trends that have occurred since the post-Watergate era onward. And so part of the reason Trump is able to do what he is doing is that, yes, he's willing to sort of ignore norms and in some case, frankly, ignore laws to do what he's pursuing with, let's say, creating a slush fund for Venezuelan oil or what have you. But it's also the case that Congress, frankly, is out of practice when it comes to acting as a constraint on any kind of foreign policy behavior. And indeed, Congress over the last century has sort of almost had a position of we actually should not be the ones setting tariffs. So after the wake of Smoot-Hawley, for example, 100 years ago, Congress decided we should delegate a lot of these powers to the president and so forth. So that's part of why, in some ways, that's kind of the permissive condition that you need to talk about for why this sort of neo-royalist order can potentially emerge. And I think, as Stacey pointed out in their paper, it's not clear if it's going to consolidate. It's sort of one possible thing. I think the really interesting thing about in terms of economic statecraft, there's two things that are legitimately intriguing, I guess, from an analytical perspective. From an American perspective, I'm not thrilled about it, but from an analytical perspective, it's interesting. The first is the degree to which, the United States has decided, hey, we have a lot of advantages when it comes to things like weaponized interdependence. Global capital markets run through the United States. There are various areas, even in tech, where there are key U.S. components that are absolutely vital to global supply chains. We have an extremely large market. We can use these things to try to coerce other actors. And you've seen this from the Liberation Day tariffs onward, with, frankly, a mixed track record of success. It turns out that the U.S. is able to, by and large, coerce its allies pretty effectively. They're not going to get huge things in return for that, but they're going to get some concessions. And then when it comes to countries like China, the U.S. backed down like a scared puppy. So the question of the sort of long-term effects of this, in other words, to what extent will allies and partners of the United States still consider the United States an ally or a partner if this persists? And I think there's valid reasons to wonder about that. I think the second sort of analytical question, and I don't have a great answer to this, but it's an interesting question, is to build on the neo-royalist story, is whether or not this theory of interdependence will work. In other words, is there a royalist piece? So international relations scholars like to think about a commercial peace, right? The idea that if two countries are significantly and economically intertwined, it raises the cost to both of them if they were going to choose to go to war. Peace. That's not what neo-royalism is, though. It's not about broad-based economic interdependence. It is literally about an elite network being intertwined. And it is possible that that elite network being intertwined could actually cause states that otherwise might be inclined to go to war to decide, you know what, it's not worth it. I'm really rich. Why do I want to risk those networks? But it is also possible that either it's not that effective a constraint, instead of a sort of royalist peace, what you actually have is a royalist extractive cartel.
Great. Thank you for that. Dan brought up China. A lot of public debate frames China as either trying to overthrow the international system or simply free riding on it. You've suggested, I think, a more complicated picture. And it's very hard to have a conversation about international affairs and not talk about China. So how do you see China and, perhaps even the BRICS more broadly operating within international institutions, within regional organizations today? And what do you think that suggests about where the global order might be headed?
Well, part of the answer is obvious. China is not the one that's overthrowing or trying to overthrow the liberal order. The United States is. We could say that China had an agenda maybe a few years ago, but right now Trump is trying to overthrow the liberal order, has maybe already done that. China is not trying to overthrow the WTO. China is not withdrawing from multilateral institutions. And in many cases, it's trying to, of course, manipulate them and get its people into those organizations, but it's not always succeeding. Just a very quick point about the royalists, because both Dan and Stacey have talked about it. And I support that idea that it's something that you want to bring into the mix. It's going to be a mix of different types of orders, and whatever it is, the BRICS and the Chinese are going to play a very important part of it. So we should just accept it rather than fear it.
Great, thank you. And I'll just get in one more question before turning to the Q&A box. So if you're listening and you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. And I see a lot coming in there already. So Stacey, last question for you. You've touched on some of the recent foreign policy moves by Washington. I'd love for you to just expand on that a little bit in this context of a neo-royalist world order, and more looking ahead, what kinds of developments would confirm or challenge your theory?
I would say, and I think this draws off a lot of what my colleagues are saying as well. This is a really unsettled moment. So I'm not even sure if I'm comfortable saying confirm or deny, because it's this when Abe and I are talking about it, it's one element that's out there, right? And we in some ways believe it's always been out there, right? There have always been people who have been interested, leaders interested in this, right? Orban was interested in far before Trump was. Erdogan was interested in far before Trump was. This is a particularly important moment, both because of the decline of liberal international institutions and because an actor that is so powerful, the United States under Trump, is the one that is actually kind of making the case and following this impulse into the order. But ultimately, if in a few years, it sounds like Abe and I were, invested way too much in our fantasy novels, great. Like I'll be totally happy with this outcome. I would love to be proved wrong. Let's just wait a few years and then we'll go back to normal. The more all of this gets embedded, right? And what are the types of things that'll get embedded? Let me just go through a couple of instances, as you said, kind of unpacking U.S. foreign policy, right? Do we really end up with a board of peace, right? Not only, the United States kind of ignoring the United Nations Security Council, the United Nations system, but setting up a parallel institution, right? Allowing people to kind of buy their way onto that institution. Going back to Dan was giving these fantastic descriptions of actors, who are benefiting economically from this, right? NVIDIA basically being able to access China again, deep ties, financial ties between the United States technology companies on the one hand and the Gulf states on the other. Those don't just go away once Trump goes away, right? So today we can look at particular instances and say, okay, Trump's foreign policy here confirms this, right? It's foreign policy by the few, for the few, and deeply extractive, right? But I think then the question is, what's the evidence that it becomes part of a system, right? And maybe it's not the only order, but it is one of the dominant orders. And I think we're looking to see how deeply all of these material and symbolic institutions, how deeply they become embedded in the international order.
Thank you. Okay, so the picture I'm getting is we're getting, it might just be a slight, or not slight, but a recalibration of a lot of different systems that have already existed, but we're kind of playing up some of them more at this moment, and it is going to be quite messy, I think, is the operative word.
And just to draw the domestic analogy, I hope that all of us are learning that institutions are only as strong as the practices that undergird them, right? So to that extent, we can port that kind of same insight into international relations. The practices, how people are actually doing international relations, that's what's going to make the system run.
Thank you. I'm getting a couple of questions that ask about the role of the United States as a rogue actor, and what might constrain the United States in that sense. And as an addendum to that, someone also wants to know how that affects your careers as geopolitical analysts. But Amitav, I'd like to just start with you, and Dan or Stacey, if you'd like to jump in. If the U.S. is seen as a rogue state, what constrains it, or what might emerge to constrain it?
I have, in my latest article in Foreign Policy, I call it the indispensable rogue. It used to be that Madeleine Albright, the former secretary, said U.S. is the indispensable nation. We cannot do cooperation without the United States. That will remain the case. U.S. can be the biggest spoiler if it doesn't get involved. And there would be probably a regime change in Washington, either a moderate Republican, if there is a Democratic president, who will try to bring U.S. back into multilateral institutions and start cooperation. It's not really, you can have 300 executive orders in the first few days to reverse many, not all of the Trump's policies. Some damage will be long-term. But even if that is done, the trust will never regain the trust of the community, including its allies.
To what extent is your formulation American-centric to the extent that you are framing things through the American example? If I'm sitting, for example, in a BRIC member state, does the global order look very different with informal multilateral or mini institutions being built from the bottom up? Trump, Putin, and less so may conform to the strongman image. But he's saying, but the rest of the world, including the EU, and I think that this is an important point, are busy rerouting globalization and building alternative structures.
So yeah, the questioner raises an extremely valid point, which is to say that while the United States has made it clear that it doesn't necessarily respect the WTO anymore or is withdrawing from a whole bevy of international treaties and organizations, this hasn't stopped other countries from trying to, maintain that kind of trade integration. You've seen the EU reach out and launch a variety of trade deals. You've seen, as a response to the United States, or really Trump spurning Modi in India, Modi suddenly re-embracing the possibility of the BRICS, that iconic photo in Beijing of him with Putin and Xi. There is no doubt that other countries are trying to go about and, preserve the good bones that they like, or, build a little guest house of their own that they might like, that doesn't necessarily include the United States. I will say that the reason we're focusing on the United States, and this remains true, is that I do think there's been a situation since 2008 to underestimate the degree to which the U.S. has underwritten the sort of rules of the game that existed in the liberal international order. And the degree to which, if you have, for lack of a way of putting it, regime change within the hegemon, what does that mean for the overall order? Now, it is true. I want to be very clear about this. The United States is not an all-powerful hegemon. The U.S. is not nearly as powerful now as it was, let's say, even 15 years ago. And I would also add, building on what Stacey said in terms of sort of the neo-royalist networks, I guarantee you that where people have their money parked, if there is a crisis that affects the United States or that leads to a rout of U.S. treasuries, that is not just going to affect the U.S.
So, for example, Amitav has been talking the importance of Xi, and Xi and is very much a strong man and is a consolidated power. But interestingly enough, is consolidated power in China around the idea of anti-corruption, right? So even that doesn't sit particularly well with this neo-royalist vision. So I think that's really a real potential part of pushback.
Thank you. And I'll stick with you, Stacey. We have a question here for you where they write, the neo-royalist theory appears to lead to greater chances of collusion between the global players, but how could they end up competing against each other? And could that lead to greater instability?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it opens up a lot of collusion of the type we've been talking about, the ideas of cartels, the ideas of, royalty and courts. That can be arguably kind of a fairly cooperative world, but there's so much potential tension built into the system, right? Nobody would say the dynasties of past were somehow peaceful. But I think the question is not so much whether or not there's conflict. It's not a question of a binary of war and peace. It's the question of the dimensions of conflict. What are actually the flashpoints here, right? And when I think of an order to stand out, one is questions of succession. Right? Who actually gets to lead this order forward, presuming that Trump or, and Putin and whomever don't actually live forever? Assuming that, what kind of battles are we likely to see internally and externally over who actually gets to lead this movement forward? And the other one are battles over recognition. Right. And part of what we're saying is that this isn't just about like financial dominance. It's not just about economic extraction. It's status extraction. Right. It's recognition. And again, to kind of juxtapose this to great power competition, we've already brought this up. Look what happens to Modi in India, right? When he refuses to recognize Trump's claim that Trump brought peace to India and Pakistan, right? Immediate kind of imposition of tariffs. This is a country that the United States has been kind of trying to woo into U.S. orbit for at least a decade because of China. And this battle over status recognition instead led to conflict, right? Now, this is a bit of a one-off, but then the question becomes, can you imagine broader battles that could happen over failures to recognize spheres of influence, over failures to recognize demands to extract resources, over failures to recognize who's the dominant actor in the system?
Great. Thank you. And for you, Dan, you mentioned the gradual decline of congressional power in foreign policy. How could that branch take back its power or potentially increase its role?
There's a quick answer and there's a longer term answer. The short term answer is because, we are so polarized in terms of political parties, you would need Democrats to win in the midterms in terms of taking control of the House. The Senate is going to be a much more uphill climb, but it is actually conceivable that that could happen as well. If you have opposition control of Congress, you are suddenly going to see, a lot more sort of, activity, if nothing else, holding hearings, subpoenaing, executive branch officials and so forth, trying to do that. On the other hand, we also saw this play out after the 2018 midterms. It didn't lead to a lot, although it did lead to an impeachment or two. The deeper answer is that you are going to need a broad bipartisan. There's only two ways this happens. Either the first is that Trump fails so miserably, or there is such a backlash to him that there is not just a blue wave, but a blue tsunami, where you suddenly have Democrats really dominating Congress in a way that they haven't, since 2009. Post-Watergate, we need to actually rein in the powers of the presidency. And they will have political incentives to do that if they recognize that the next president is likely to be a Democrat. And, that could lead to the passage of laws, or just, for lack of a way of putting it, Congress remembering its muscle memory of, oh, yeah, we used to hold oversight hearings.
Stacey, we have a question here. Does the global order now get reduced to deals and payments? And have there been instances of this in the past?
Not at all. And as a matter of fact, this is why I think sometimes Abe and I push back against the idea that, well, and this is always the case. Here come the crony capitalism. I think that there are a few reasons why it's not just simply kind of deals and exchanges. The first of which, again, I really want to highlight what we see is the important non-material aspect of this, the recognition, the deference, the domination, right? We were talking earlier about the kind of, and this came up, I'm talking like the kind of more idealistic human yearning for progress and for rules. I think it's worthwhile to remember the not so idealistic human yearnings for power and status recognition, right? Unfortunately, some of our baser instincts, right? So with that in mind, you realize that like deals and exchanges, there's something else that's really non-material. And the second thing that I would say, and this would be kind of looking ahead to a more settled moment, every single order has to have with it a purpose and a legitimation, right? A way in which we understand why this is the way things should be. And again, I'm not saying that we're there yet. As a matter of fact, I think this is one of the most unsettled parts of the order is what does this all mean? And why is this legitimate? But I expect to see some, movement and attempts to make sense of it and to narrate that. I think we already are, to be clear. But
Dan, we have a question here. Easy one. What is the future for democracies in this new era when the United States, its greatest example, is sliding under authoritarianism in a world that is increasingly dominated by strongmen and insecurity?
So glad Dan got this one.
So I think there are two ways to answer this. The first is there's a colleague of ours named Siva who wrote a great book about what happens when when there's a power shift and the hegemon is of a different regime type. So in other words, what happens if suddenly like a democracy surges to become the most powerful actor in the world, and didn't talk about what would happen if there was a regime change within the most powerful country in the world. And that's what makes this so unusual, this current moment, because you've got, Polity and others claiming the U.S. is no longer a consolidated democracy. If you really believe that the U.S. is now a sort of quasi-authoritarian state, and I don't want to, I'll hedge on whether that's actually true or not in a second. But if you accept that, then yeah, the implications are pretty wide-ranging. And you've already seen that within the Trump administration. The Trump administration has evinced zero concern for human rights or democracy promotion, unless it's a state that it already doesn't like. It's ostensibly done this for Venezuela, for example, but the hypocrisy on this is just sort of massive. And so it has withdrawn, USAID funding. It's made it clear that it really does not care about these things, which therefore makes it easier. And furthermore, the U.S. has shown an eagerness to cut deals with, various local warlords is an unfair term, but in some ways, like local leaders. The 64 question, I don't know how to put it, is this the future for the United States? And I think we still don't know that answer. This is where, there is no denying that if you look at things going on in the United States right now in terms of the Trump administration, in terms of, aggrandizement of executive power, the dispatch of federal National Guard troops into various American cities, what's going on in Minneapolis right now, it is very easy to say, well, the U.S. is no longer really a consolidated democracy. But even those who have sort of made this statement in terms of among political scientists have also acknowledged that the courts still matter. Congress still matters. Part of the reason that the administration has been able to do what it's wanted to is that since Republicans control majorities in both houses of Congress, they have been extremely reluctant to step up. I guess my point is that if it's easy to say things have changed and they can't be reversed, but I also am old enough to remember when people were having this conversation 8 years ago and saying the same thing. So we will have to, and I know this is a dodge, but we'll have to wait and see on this.
Great. Thank you. We have just a few minutes left, so I'll just close with a kind of a rapid fire question for each of you. And, I'm going to close with Mark Carney again, just because that was the Davos speech I watched. I haven't watched Trump's yet. And he said, we are in the middle of a rupture, not a transition. So, from each of you, starting, Dan, Stacey, is this a rupture? Is it a transition? Is it something else entirely?
So if I go first, I am a little amused by all this talk coming out of Carney, and I respect him. I'm actually both a Canadian and an American citizen, so things fall apart and I might go take it.
Damn it, you have options.
But I think the general thing is that this has been happening for quite some time. And the Davos that Huntington put it, where were they all this time? Why couldn't they see this coming? I mean, many academics have pointed this out. Of course, these academics don't get invited to. So what he said is very important, but I think about 10 years too late. But we should take it seriously, and I think it's a transformation. It's not. If it is a rupture, it's a very significant rupture. There is no going back, and except that some elements will survive, and countries like Canada have an important role. Canada going to China, signing deals is what I call wall -1. Cooperation will continue without the United States. European Union, India negotiating a free trade. European Union signed a big trade deal with Mercosur in Latin America. So those things will be happening. And I think we should, the key point is that let's not bemoan what's gone. Let's just live with it and make the best of it and look for new possibilities. And that's basically what I've been arguing since 2014 and including in the new book.
Dan, rupture, transition, something else?
Believe it was a Farewell to Arms in Hemingway. One character asked another, how did you go bankrupt? And he said 2 ways, slowly and then suddenly. And so to build on what Amitav said, yeah, there have been long-term sort of trends that have suggested that the order was already on its sort of last legs. But like any Jenga tower, you can take off the pillars and the structure will remain standing right up until the moment that it doesn't. And so what we're seeing is the sort of last, now we're in the sort of cascade moment where it does seem to be falling apart. So there are both underlying and proximate causes, but yeah, it's a rupture.
Stacey, final word?
I mean, agree with everything they've said about the fact that this is a long time coming. I guess what I would say is rupture, transition. How about a moment of order making and contestation? Mm-hmm. And the argument here should be, take it seriously. Even the parts that don't seem serious, take it seriously, because the people are going to need to throw their power behind the order that they want to see.
On that note, thank you all. This has been incredibly helpful, I think, in this very, for us, at least unparalleled time, and not certainly within world history if we take a longer view. I really appreciate your taking the time, sharing your insights. And with that, Amitav, Dan, Stacey, thank you so much. It was such an honor to talk with you today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.